Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Get Out of Rap. Today I'm joined by Laura Scott, who is the Chief Operating Officer for Dialect up there in the Northeast. Laura, welcome to Get Out of Rap.
Thank you for having us and letting us come on and tell you a bit about myself and also the Dialect story.
Yeah, no problem. And I should have said, we were just talking about it. Can you add speaker to your list of skills now?
Yes, we'll add that just kind of at the bottom for now. But yeah, more public speaking events to follow.
And that was
because
because last week you spoke at an event, right?
Yes, yeah. We were invited to speak at an event, FinTech North. So it's very much an industry event for the area that we're servicing in terms of our services. It had an opportunity to showcase who we are and what we're doing in front of a room of a few hundred people, which is always a nice opportunity, and to do it face to face as well.
Yes, that makes a pleasant change, doesn't it?
It does. So it was good fun. It's good to get out and about and yeah, just tell everyone kind of who we are and what we're doing.
Now, I'd love to start with, as is the way on the podcast, is to jump into finding out a bit more about you, because as a lady, C-level, I think, I know from the demographics of people that listen, they are really keen on their career and their progression. So how have you got to where you've got to today?
Hey, great question. So I'm not from the contact center background. I haven't, spent my life in the contact center industry. Where I've spent a long time, so the last 10 plus years was in a fintech financial services company, and we provided gift cards for shopping centres across the UK, the Middle East and Europe. So my role there was a head of operations. So within that head of operations role was the customer support element of the service that we offered to end users and shopping centres. So I have a lot of knowledge and experience of how to kind of take a contact centre which was solely operating for UK and then build that out to then introduce multilingual, introduce extended operating hours. And we've seen some of the challenges that we had when you're trying to work with existing systems and you're trying to move into new territories and bring new channels in. So I can draw a lot on that experience in terms of what we're then doing at Dialect. Now, another key element of my role and a massive passion of mine is the technology side of it. So I spent time developing out with a great team in terms of products that we could sell gift cards. So we had our own proprietary system that sold gift cards via till or web or self-service or via iPad. So technology was a big form of the role. Managed a project team and a software development team as well. So I'd say my experience quite wide and vast. As a head of operations, you've got quite a lot of remit, and which is fantastic. And that's kind of where I love to be, kind of right in the middle of it all and making sure that it all hangs together. And I think it's important, and again, I've kind of brought that into Dialect, is that, everything that we do, we've got to not just consider the end users, but also consider the internal users and how we make their lives easier and better. So I spent 10 years at FlexiCard, got lots of experience, joined the company as a bit of a kind of startup scale up, and we grew the business, to quite a very successful level. And that's where I gained a lot of my experience, hands-on and getting amongst it, and also the strategy side of it as well.
I love the fact, and it's something that comes up quite often around the different routes that people take to where they get to. And one of the key messages, I think, is that there's no set way. You don't, I was an agent, but it doesn't mean you have to be an agent. You came into the industry another route. And I think that's reassuring for people to know that it doesn't really matter where you start. It's more about how who you are and how you apply yourself. What kind of things would you share? And this is always difficult for people, right? Because they've got to kind of talk about themselves. But what, you're a chief operating officer now. It's a great position to have attained. What would you put that down to in terms of how you've applied yourself, the lessons you would want to share with people?
So for me, I think it's really understanding how a business works and, you know, getting ingrained in that and looking for improvements and continuous change. So it's not about, you know, sitting thinking, yes, that works and it works now, but it's always looking to the future and how we can make improvements. So for me, I think anyone, it's a really good question, isn't it? You're right. It's a difficult one to kind of answer. I think it in being very inquisitive and asking lots of questions and, you know, spending time with people, getting under the hood of things, and I'm quite hands-on and yes, I've got to take a step back at times, you know, in kind of a strategic level role, but I still think it's important to have that level of hands-on approach and feel that the team can, anyone in Dialect has got access to speak to myself and the CEO. We're very open. We want to have open conversations, and I think that is equally important. Being accessible and not kind of pulling yourself away always, but that fine line as well of you know, stepping back to look at the strategy and the longer term plans.
And that you mentioned their inquisitiveness, and I love that, because I think it's, you know, if you're in a room of people and maybe there's a burning question that people want to ask, I think it's always interesting the person that says, sorry, I don't get it, or can you explain it again, or what does this mean? Has that always been your way?
Yes, always try to understand, always ask questions, and equally share knowledge as well. You know, make sure that other people within the business do understand it. It's not just about retaining that knowledge, it's sharing that knowledge and making everyone aware of how things work, or, you know, what direction we want to be heading in, and what our plans are for the future as well. So it's getting that buy-in. So it's not just, you know, like I say, keeping yourself isolated from it all. Encourage inquisitiveness amongst everyone to ask questions, and through that you often find that a team becomes more engaged, to become more interested in what's happening, and you value their feedback as well.
I think it's often the case, isn't it, that certainly my experience, or that people have come on the podcast and talked about, is the nature of operations. Given it's so busy, one of the things that's often forgotten is sharing the work, the thoughts, the output with other parts of the business. You very much tend to work in your lane and you're just busy, and then other support functions that you need to involve and rely on are told at the end of a process often, and they're like,
Yes.
what are you up to now?
I totally agree with you, and I think in particularly in Dialect, what we're trying to do is make sure that, because we're still quite a young company, and making sure that the head of customer experience and, you know, all of our team actually see the product that we're evolving, that we're developing out, and getting their input and feedback. So, you know, we're looking at from a product point of view and going, that sounds like a really awesome feature, would love to have it. But in reality, is it going to make their lives easier? Is it going to add value for what they're doing day to day? So what we're you know, looking to do is proof of concept kind of everything, and then put it into the team, see how it works, see if they like it before we do big rollouts. Because, you know, you could spend hours and days and months and, you know, on features, and you go, this sounds, you know, really good. You put it into production and people go, that doesn't help BAU. And so, you know, from an operational point of view, you're absolutely spot on. It's engaging the wider business to make sure that what we're doing actually has real benefit, and it's not just a tick box exercise, or it's not just something someone thinks is a great idea.
And that's because you're right, because it can work the other way. I can remember there's, you know, technical teams coming into ops and saying, and they're really enthusiastic, we've added this new feature, it's amazing, it's brilliant, here's how it works. And very quickly, from an ops point of view, because you're customer facing, you know, and it's like bursting their bubble a little bit, that we're never going to use that. It's not going to be used.
Definitely. And I think I'm in a very fortunate position, and I have been in previous roles where I kind of span that, because I've got the operational remit, and that's, you know, what I've got to kind of focus on day to day. I also have the technical and the product side of it. So having them kind of interlinked actually works really well, because you're always looking at a new feature or a new piece of software or whatever it might be, and thinking, how does that actually work day to day in operationally? So it's quite a fortunate kind of mix of the elements in terms of what I'm working on and with at the moment as well. But
do you think, because you know, you are a young COO, a young lady, have you faced any barriers, or are there, are there anything that you would do differently in your kind of rise?
Um, Barriers, I wouldn't say I have. I think I've been very fortunate. I've had really good support around in terms of peers and managers, and it's been a nice kind of evolution and journey. So I've been really fortunate, and there's been no kind of, I'd say, opportunities that I haven't been able to kind of go for. Yeah, it's I'm just sitting reflecting here as you've asked that question, if there has been anything in particular, but I'd say I've been really fortunate in terms of the support group that I've had around us to kind of get to the level that I'm at now.
And do you know what? I think that's a really key message around for people that are wanting to progress at the same, to the same place you're at. Is so if you're not surrounded by good people at a peer level and a mentoring manager level, it's going to be a challenge, right? Regardless of gender, age, any of the demographics. The key, and sometimes that was a little bit lost at me at times, because you think, well, I've got all these characteristics. I'm ambitious. I want to do this. I'm gonna make it. But without, and you've used the word "we" a hell of a lot already. That sense of team, and where you sit in, and having that support function, that support group around you, is so key to individual and collective success, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think if you've got good leaders, then that's going to encourage people and motivate them to want to grow and develop and move to the next level. And yeah, I have been very fortunate in that respect.
You create your own luck, though, don't you?
Sometimes, yeah, it's hard work as well. I'm not going to say that it's not, and you've always kind of going above and beyond and doing that extra bit, but that's fine as well. It's not a bad thing.
No, absolutely not. Well, let's bring it up to date then in terms of the role at Dialect. When did you join Dialect?
Yeah, so I've been with Dialect since, well, what year? Last year. Was it last
Time's
year?
a bit bendy at the moment.
Yeah, it is. So what year are we in and what month we're in? So Dialect's a very young business. Would class ourselves as a startup. We've been in operation since 2020, so we're still very young. And the reason I came into the business and into the role was to really help define out our operational kind of strategy and approach, coupled with building out our technology stack. And again, that's where the kind of passion lies. So I had a very, very fortunate opportunity and challenging to kind of look at what technology we wanted, how we wanted to hang together. And yeah, the first kind of week that I came in was, right, let's get all the requirements together that we need and want from a system, thinking about a previous experience, what's on the market, and kind of defined out, a list of requirements of like 165 different items. And then we went out to market to look at what solutions were available. So a really, fantastic opportunity to be able to really shape what technology we wanted to put in that would meet the needs of our people, with the view of what our business was going to be today and in the future as well. Always had the vision of multilingual, 24/7, 365. So everything that we had designed from a solutions point of view and operational point of view, it's done so with the view that that's where we're heading to. And I think that's been a massive advantageous to us, because we haven't had to deal with legacy. We haven't had to, come in halfway through and then try and steer a ship round, which is difficult. We started with a blank piece of paper, and it's been a fantastic kind of journey so far to where we're at. And already we're proud of what we've achieved. We're working with clients in the UK, Europe, and the US. We've built a team from kind of ground zero all the way up to not far off 40 heads, I believe now. Already 24/7, 365.
Really?
Yeah, so we've achieved a lot in a short period of time. And I think that's because we had a clear vision, and the technology is pretty damn good.
And you mentioned there two key things that I know are big challenges, as you say, is multilingual for one,
Mhm.
and kind of continual service availability across the year being another. Did you do them both at the same time, or just?
We started recruiting a team who had multilingual capabilities right from the offset. And what we did is we looked at what languages would be most prevalent. So
Mm,
we selected a core language skill set. So, started with Spanish, Italian, English, French, because what we've seen is that works in Europe, but that also spans out then to rest of
mm,
world because of the
mm,
language skills. So
mm,
multilingual was always in my strategy for recruitment from day one and building that team out. And then down the line, we started then introducing the 24/7 and the 365. So it wasn't a big bang of everything at once. We've gradually built up to that operational hours increasing, and still got there very quickly. But yeah, the way that we planned, kind of the operational approach was always get languages in, because we're going to need them.
And when you were doing your recruitment, so if you launched during the pandemic.
We did indeed. Yes,
Yeah.
which was fun. But equally, I
Yeah.
think it's put us in a good place when it comes to we were remote first, and that's
Yeah.
always what we're kind of going to be. So again, all of our approaches and strategies to, how we onboard, how we go put the team through kind of grad bays, if you like, continuous professional development for the team, communication, we've had to do it all on screen.
Mm,
So we're in a great position that way because the business started from that point.
yeah.
Whereas then we introduced back when we're all, able to come back in the office and things, and we go back to a level of normality, and you kind of start your face-to-face communications and training and whatnot. So
So do you have people geographically that are going to stay remote, and some that are able to come in and they flex either way, right? Or
yes, that's exactly the kind of approach we've got. So some team members are going to be 100% remote based. Some are more locally based, and we encourage them to come into the hub, so to speak.
mm,
And it gives them an opportunity to meet their peers, meet the rest of the team. And some of the team we still haven't actually met face to face, which is outstandingly bizarre, but
yeah.
it works. And we are actively encouraging all of the team to come in at some point so we can have a proper get together,
Mm.
and meet everyone, which will be amazing.
Because I've got a lot of experience in the challenges of multilingual recruitment,
Hmm.
because that naturally means that the bar's been raised even when you're talking about advisors, customer facing, that your first level entrance to the company. The moment you add in the requirement of languages, you're reducing your pool significantly, aren't you?
You are, but I think we're in a different kind of world now where doors have opened a lot easier to be able to get skills in from all over the UK,
Mm,
without a challenge. And we
yeah.
wouldn't have had that pre-pandemic
Mm,
because we wouldn't have been able to tap into some fantastic resources and talent and experience because we weren't necessarily looking outside our doorstep.
mm,
So for me, I think that's a huge advantage in terms of what has came out of the back end of the pandemic is the ability to attract talent from anywhere.
mm.
Um, and we're still keen to do that. And, we're still bring them on the journey in terms of who Dialect is, what we stand for, our vision and values, and we're kind of confident that we're building a really good culture here, even though it's a mix of remote and kind of face-to-face.
And what's important then? What's important to you in terms of the culture?
Putting people at the center of that is key. We want people to join Dialect and feel that they're part of a team, that we're all on the same kind of trajectory, and they're well aware of that. And we want them to develop. We want to bring people into the business who want to develop a career in it. As
Mm,
our business grows, there's more and more opportunities, and I'm
mm,
sure yourself, in this industry, it's about getting talent and retaining it and giving them opportunities in different areas that people might want to develop
yeah.
in. And there's so many cross-functional roles within contact centers. that's what we need to be shouting about and telling people of how many
Completely.
opportunities are available. You know, you could come in as an advisor and that's where you start, but you've got a massive passion for compliance, or, you know, you love finance, then the opportunities are there if people want them, and certainly within a growing business like Dialect, because we're evolving, you know, every month.
100%. Yeah, I love it. That gives me goosebumps. Just that kind of the chance to take people on when you are still a startup and growing. It's not easier. That's the wrong word, because it's still a challenge. But in terms of being able to paint a picture of what the future could look like with the right application and the possibilities that people have, there's something enticing about startups and certainly growing businesses, because I think you would still class yourself as a startup, right?
Yeah, I'd still class ourselves as a startup, absolutely. You know, we're still developing in so many areas, and there's so many opportunities kind of coming our way as well. And I think a lot of the you know, through the recruitment process, a lot of the new team members actually really resonate with the startup and the opportunities, because it's new, it's exciting. We've got lots of different things that we're kind of looking at going forward. But startups are equally, you know, a challenge as well, because there's so much going on and we're trying to do so much. But you know, it's a fantastic environment, and you know, we feel so motivated to do what we're doing and build a fantastic team with some, like I say, I go back to the technology. The technology is key, you know, with some great tech behind us, and kind of deliver out just a really good solution to clients. So that, you know, that it's quite simplistic in terms of what we want to achieve. But yeah, it's an exciting journey to be on, for sure.
Well, you've mentioned before your passion for the technology, and that's something that excites you. Let's talk about that now. But also, you said something interesting around, and let me hope I get this right, that it was key that it wasn't just about the impact it has for your clients, but it's the impact it has for your internal team. And that's been fundamental to how you've developed your technology. Is that right?
That's 100% right, yes.
Yes, good.
So in previous lives, having, you know, run a kind of contact center element, it's difficult. It's so difficult to have so many different systems. And we had that, you know, we had our telephony system, we had our live chat, we then handling emails via another system. And it puts extra strain and extra pressure, if you like, on advisors to be able to not only have to deal with different channels, but channels in different places. Nothing's joined up. So one of the main things that I wanted to do was have a true omni-channel solution where our team had one interface, everything came into them, they knew exactly who they were speaking to if they came in before, you know, and what channel they did come to us in, and they've got that single view, and they're not having to log into another system. They forget to log out of one system, that, you know, they're trying to work another. So that was core to what we wanted as a solution. Making a customer experience better for internal team ultimately delivers a better customer experience out to the end user, because you're not, you know, flicking between screens and whatnot. So that's always been the core driver, and we'll continue to develop the system out. So we're using Amazon Connect. Amazon connects our technology stack, and you know, because it's so fast evolving, there's so many new features being released. We're looking at them and saying, right, could we use that for our team, and how would it benefit them? And that's going to be a continuous iteration all the time. We're not going to just sit and rest on what we've got. We want to continuously make improvements, actively speak to the team and say, feedback anything that you think we could improve on or make changes, and we'll put that in our roadmap. Equally, in that product roadmap is the front-facing pieces for the clients as well. But yeah, it's so important the team have a good system to work with.
I think there's actually research now from 2 different sources that says you can make a link, or there is a link rather, from the number of systems that agents have to access and use to do their job and attrition. So the moment, I mean, even 5, it seems ridiculous, not ridiculous, but it's too many. But at the moment you go over 5, systems, the percentages massively increase in terms of what your attrition is. And I know firsthand personal experience, but also still seeing it today. It's having to navigate across so many different systems and interfaces whilst maintaining a conversation with a customer is a mental challenge that seems to me now that people don't need to have. When you've got access to technology that we could only dream of a few years ago, why? And I get it cost, but we should be looking at those types of things far more than we do, because we're asking people to do too many mental jumps continually whilst delivering a great customer experience. Like you say, it's hard.
Yeah, and I think that it's always going to be a challenge in terms of systems, and you're always going to have, us as a BPO, there's always systems that a client's going to use, so you're going to have that, but at least give the team one interface that every interaction comes through and they're working in, and we enhance it to make, the information that they've got presented on screen, so they know, what queue it is, or they know the query type, or they know who it is. And Mr. Jones has already phoned us 3 times and he's dropped us an email, and that just, I think, makes focus a lot easier. And then the other peripheral systems, they don't seem as overwhelming, because you've got that one system where you know everything's coming into.
Exactly. So it was kind of outlook inward in terms of your teams to make it really, really clear what's been, and then when you take that out to the customer, what's been some of the things that you've done there?
So in terms of customer facing, we leverage all of the different channels that Amazon Connect supports. So we offer email, chat, voice, Facebook, WhatsApp. So we offer all of them to clients. Clients can have as much flexibility and personalization as they want, and we fly the flag for personalization, because we fundamentally think that's very important, that a client's getting a solution that works for their business. So within the fintech industry, you might have 2 very different products and 2 very different demographics. So a voice, first strategy might not be right for that other digital first strategy that another client's looking at. So what we want customers to do is look at the service offering we have, pick what works for them and their end users, and then in time we can easily add new channels in, remove them if they feel like they're not working. And that for us is very important in terms of our offering out to clients. We want them to have that flexibility, and because we're also working with fintechs who are startups and scale ups, we don't want them kind of in a solution that might work for them in day one, but actually is very much different in 6 months' time, because their products evolved and changed, and their end users have potentially changed as well in terms of their needs. So that's, from a product point of view, we wanted something outwardly facing that was very flexible and agile and could be scaled very quick as well.
No, go on.
Sorry. No, go on.
I was just going to say, what are the channels? What are you seeing in terms of the channels that your clients are coming? Has there been anything surprising there, or what's the sort of trend?
I think definitely slanted towards digital first in terms of, your chats, your emails. I think there's more traction with the socials as well. I don't think that's a huge area yet, but I definitely see that as going to be one for the future. And voice is always going to play a part, and I don't think that's ever going to disappear. However, we do have clients who are very much, we just want to go with chat and email, and we don't want to introduce voice. However, we have seen instances where voice has then eventually been added because it's needed for whatever reasons. But for me, digital first, and again, we've developed out with our partners a really robust chat and live chat solution, which is actually multilingual, handles up to 75 different languages. So we're investing heavily in that channel as well, because we see the value in that.
And how much of that chat, especially the multilingual element, is automated? How much of it is it's your advisors?
So the majority is, I'd say, advisor led, and it's genuine live chat. As a product and service offering, we're building proof of concepts at the moment for chatbots. So we're going to add that in to to what we're offering. Again, we can personalize that for every client, depending upon what their product is, what their question, and then where we need to push a user to get that information, if it's an FAQ page on their website or wherever it might reside. So again, chatbots for the future, but I like to get that. For me, I think it's the right balance between presenting the information, guiding, and then the ability to connect to an advisor when you need to, particularly in the industry that we're servicing as well. People want to be able to speak to people. It's not all about automation.
Yeah, and I guess that means, because also how much do the regulatory requirements come into play as well?
Yeah, so for us, because we use client systems to access that data, we don't actually have that information within our system. So we're not regulatory requirements around that. But what we do is we limit the information that someone can input into us. So we very much will guide that. So we have a pre-chat form, for example, on live chat. We gather certain information, and then we'll prompt what information we want as part of the conversation to guide. So yeah, that it's 100% a part of a consideration that we have to have. We just don't fall within the regulatory requirements because we're not holding that information in the Dialect system. And we're very purposefully designed it that way. So it's very kind of light touch in terms of what we do capture. And it's more about CRM and the experience than the actual financial information to if someone wants to know the balance of their card, or they want to mark their card lost and stolen, that sits on client side.
And given that you're multilingual, do you see differences in how customers interact culturally? Just what are their communication differences?
Very good question. There is an element of it, yes, and expectations, I guess, are different. I'd say certain countries as well have different requirements when it comes to channels that they want to interact on. So there is differences definitely from a demographic point of view. Some clients who are working in certain countries are very much a voice first, because digital is not necessarily the right strategy for them. And what we've got to remember as well is different countries have different accesses to the way that they communicate. So voice might be the default, and it might not be that everyone's got access to devices or connection. So it's very much, again, going back to that tailoring and the ability to tailor depending upon where a client is and where their product is being launched or delivered.
It's fascinating, isn't it, just to see how different countries are at different stages, how they interact, they want to do things differently. I think that's another element I've always found fascinating. I've been lucky that I've worked in multilingual providers more often than not, and I've just find, and then when you add in, like you say, all of the different channels that people have available now, it's another thing that just is very interesting.
Yeah, and terminology, I guess, is another thing. So in the UK and Europe, if you've got a card, you've got a PIN number. It might not be a PIN number in Brazil. It might be a 4-digit code, and they're the little kind of nuances that you've got to be aware of. And the team that we've got are very experienced in that, so we can build it out. We've got lots of native speakers from all over the world, so they can bring that experience into it as well and say, well, actually, you wouldn't know what that was because that's not a term. Which is great. Again, we'll bring that experience in when we're looking at how we build out shortcuts for live chat, and making sure that they're right for that audience and not just a blanket approach. We're very much refining them to where we're operating in as well.
You mentioned before we hit record, just, and some of this is the nature of a startup, I know, just how quickly time goes, and how we're already coming to the end of July when we're recording this. And when you look ahead, what excites you about the rest of the year for you and the team?
So new clients that we're going to be onboarding and working with Dialect, growing the team out, bringing new people and experience and skills into the team, and I think as well evolving our product and what we're trying to achieve, and all the exciting things that Amazon Connect's delivering and how we can leverage them to as I always say, make the team's life easier, but also offer an amazing solution out to our clients as well. That it's such an exciting kind of time, and you know, yeah, I can't articulate it anymore. We're just really passionate about, you know, building the business and getting some great people on the journey with us as well. And I'll go back to it. People are fundamental in what we're doing here, because you know, without the people, you know, we wouldn't be delivering out the services that we are.
And that really comes across. But what about for you personally, when you think about the future?
So for me personally, good question. I think it's just for me, I'm really keen to kind of understand the industry a lot more. You know, get involved in a lot more kind of events and networking and all of that kind of thing. I think for me, it's learning more, and I'm happy to say that, you know, yes, we're building what we're building, but there's lots more that we can learn, or I can learn, and I want to be out there speaking to people and understanding that. You know, as I said right at the beginning, I'm very inquisitive, so I do ask a lot of questions. I do a lot of research. I'm always looking at the kind of next white paper and what's happening in the industry, and I'm trying to keep an ear to the ground, so to speak, just so we can learn from that experience, because there's so much experience out there that we can levy as well. So yeah, for me, definitely, you know, learning more about the industry and how we can kind of evolve within the wider contact center industry, and maybe bring a different perspective from kind of my background and what we're doing as well. And I'm just generally excited. I'm just so passionate about what we're doing and who we are. It's just, the future's looking very bright. And you know, hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have brought on a lot more clients, and we're operating in a lot more countries, and have expanded our team as well.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I'll be doing with the podcast is kind of maybe going on tour. So I'd love to come up to your neck of the woods and get to see the team, and because I think it's great to hear, you know, that you said it at the start, you're saying it now, just that inquisitiveness. It's about a growth mindset, isn't it? It's kind of, and it is an exciting time for you and the team at Dialect, but also just for the industry as a whole. You know, this kind of, the pandemic, I think, has shaken us up a bit, and now wherever you look, whether it's technology or people, so from the people point of view, just understanding more about neuro diversity and how best to help your teams thrive and have careers, regardless of where they start, that they love in our industry, whilst utilising some amazing technology. It's a very exciting time to be in the industry.
Definitely, and there's so many things happening, and you know, there's so many positives to shout about, and I think, you know, like yourself is doing that, and so many other people are as well, and it's just getting that message out that there's so many exciting opportunities within the industry, and you know, it's pushing barriers as well from a technology perspective. You know, for someone like Amazon to invest in the technology that they have, and you know, Microsoft have recently released a update of their kind of technology as well, aimed at this particular industry. There's something about it that, you know, these big technology giants are looking at and interested in, and yes, there's some fantastic, you know, in situ solutions as well. Let's not forget about them. And you know, I just think there's it's a very bright future, and that's the message we've got to get across, and get people kind of engaged and passionate about what opportunities are within the industry as well.
Yeah, it's been great. Laura, thanks very much for coming on. Do you like how I invited myself up to come and see you? We'll have to do another one.
I think you obviously know what the Geordie welcome's like, and it's very warm, and you know, we'll happily have you here at the Dialect. We'll call it the hub, not the office.
Okay, yeah, I like it.
Laura, anytime.
Thank you very much, and we definitely will be doing one coming. Whereabouts in the northeast?
We're in Gateshead.
Okay, lovely.
So we're right close by to the Metro Centre for any, you know, keen shoppers out there. So yeah, we're on the right side of the water, so to speak. But yeah, we're based in Gateshead. So we're planning to obviously grow the team in the offices here in the northeast as well, and that's another passion of ours. You know, we're very proud of the northeast and what we're doing. We want to create opportunities and just grow the business here.
It's a thriving area for our industry, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, it's fantastic. There's some great brands up here and attracting some really good people into their teams as well.
Well, I've really enjoyed this. I love what you're doing. I love your mindset. So thanks for giving up your time and sharing it.
Oh, I've had a great time. Thank you very much, Martin. Thanks for listening to me, walk through and yeah, it's been really good.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Take care. Speak to you soon.